Welcome to Strategy and Future. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. With me is, of course, Albert Świdziński. And our guest today is Jacob Shapiro. Hello, Jacob.
Nice to be with you. Apparently, I'm well named for a Polish audience, you were telling me.
Yes, that's exactly what we did off the record, explaining to our guests everything about the modern literature. Jacob is director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investment, and you've been our guest before at Strategy and Future. We used to talk quite a lot, but prior to the war, we are recording the war between Ukraine and Russia. We are recording our session on the 26th of April, late afternoon Warsaw time. Jacob is based in the United States. Where exactly? I didn't ask you this question, right?
Yeah, I've moved since we last talked, so I live in New Orleans now.
Oh, cool. That's cool, So, yeah, nice music, by the way. And
nice music, but also I think underappreciated. I mean, it is the most geopolitical city in the United States. For a long time, I've talked about the Mississippi River and how important it is to the United States and global affairs. And I decided to move here. No, I moved here because I fell in love with a woman from New Orleans. But it also happens to be the most important geopolitical city in the United States.
That is true. That is true. And to my amazement, people in Poland a long time ago didn't realize how important Mississippi and Missouri rivers systems are for the strategic flows of the United States. But now they know. Also, thanks to to your work in the past. So just for you to know.
Cool.
Albert, yeah.
I just wanted to mention buying from the French, right? The Louisiana back in the day, right? Yeah, it was a huge step.
That was a short-sighted sale by France. But hey, they had engaged in a war that they couldn't possibly win, which is perhaps a wonderful segue to what we're going to talk about.
Exactly. So let's move towards it. So we have the major war between in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine. Jacob, we will go, of course, into details. But what do you think? I'll ask you a tricky question. Do you think this is just a regional war? Or this is the signal of a major reshuffle of Eurasia, which might be later on called the Third World War, or something like, similar to Napoleonic era wars, something which is only one part of the major sequence of events that will change our lives?
That's a great question. I should also tell your audience that, I think, you and I have spoken many times over the year, and we've both talked about Russia's geopolitical interest and how it was definitely going to reassert itself in some of these peripheral regions. I did not think Russia was going to do this. I was completely wrong on the timing here. So I thought that this was all some kind of intimidation move to try and get political concessions. And I still honestly don't understand why the Russians did this, because from where I sit, they were getting everything they wanted politically. Europe was completely docile. It was falling apart at the seams. NATO was on its deathbed. And for some reason, Russia decided that now was the time they had to move in. And I've talked to Russian analysts. I've spent too much time thinking about it. I still don't quite understand the timing. As to your question, though, I think it's a little bit too early to tell because for whatever reason, I think Russia's not as important to the global system right now. Yes, it's a major commodity exporter, and yes, it can sort of rule whatever land it wants to, but it's really going to matter how is China going to react to this? How is India going to react to this? How is the EU going to react to this? And that, I think, is going to tell us whether this is an isolated conflict or whether it's going to go on and be the opening stage of a much broader conflict. For me, I've been looking at history, and it's hard not to think of what happened to Poland in the 1700s, where you had the three different partitions of Poland. And that was not a prelude to, a global war. What happened was three different countries. It was Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russians at the time carved Poland up over a period of 30 to 40 years. Eventually, Poland doesn't exist on the map after this period. But then that sets the table for 100 years of relative stability in Europe. You get the concert of Europe, and World War I doesn't happen until 150 years later. And that's when Poland comes back as an independent country, right? I think that's one possible scenario. The depressing scenario to me is Ukraine is just going to be divided up over time by Russia and maybe even other powers around it. The West is going to say lots of important things about how much they support Ukraine, but not do the things that are necessary to actually help them defend themselves. And maybe you get this uneasy situation where for a period of decades, there's sort of a frozen conflict. And then maybe 50 years later, something kind of erupts. I think the other thing here, though, is that, or the alternate scenario is that Ukraine is able to defend itself from Russia, maybe is even able to take back some of these lands from Russia. What if Russia starts falling apart internally because of the economic stresses of some of the things that we've seen? Then this could be a prelude to sort of a much larger conflict. I hate to be a pessimist, but I think the former is the more likely scenario, but we're in the middle of a war. One of the reasons analysts like you and me don't like war is because things are very uncertain in war, and things can happen very, very quickly that are not related to geopolitical fundamentals. So I'm keeping my mind open for both of those scenarios, and also for any other scenarios we haven't even mentioned.
Yeah, it's so, it's so nice of you that you mentioned your sort of puzzlement, just why he started it. That was exactly my feeling. I was at loss for a long time. Plus the threat that emanated against my country, if Kiev were to be seized quickly, was also, overwhelming me a bit. So first of all, I didn't understand why he did it, because all the pieces were in place for continental consolidation on terms that Russians wanted. And the United States was ebbing away from Eurasia, apparently. Still, that's a mystery why he did it. Probably there will be books about it. What pushed him to do it? Yeah, maybe a major misperception, maybe some sort of spy thing, whatever. Human factor. Who knows? But what also troubles me is the second part of your statement, that you think that this will end up with a sort of a loss, defeat by Ukrainians, because this is what we need to call it. And still, the continental consolidation project will be saved in that respect, because the Russia in the game means the continental consolidation still being in the air, which trumps the grand strategy of Poland. And this is exactly why, on the opposite side, we are helping massively Ukrainians now. And in our grand strategy, we want Ukraine to regain Crimea and Donbass and mow down the Russian ground forces for good, and deprive Russia of the great power status, and remove Russia from the capability to great power politics in Europe, because it will be out of the system. And that will put end to the continental game and restore the situation prior to the Peter the Great rule. So basically, that's a building block of the situation here. And take it from me now. How do you see structural forces? And I'm telling about shipment of food, food crisis that is sort of looming, oil, fertilizers. Let's draw the map. How those structural forces work, because I think maybe even more they will decide the fate of this confrontation that kinetic engagements on the battlefield. Or maybe I'm wrong. You tell me.
No, I think you're right. And in some ways, they already have decided it from my point of view. If Europe was not dependent on Russia for energy right now, this is a very, very different conversation that we're having. The problem is that at least for the next 1 to 2 years, Europe cannot cut off imports of Russian natural gas and oil without, I've seen 15 to 20% demand destruction in European economies. And that's just not going to work. There's no democratically elected government that is going to walk to its population and say, hey, we have to reduce our energy consumption by 20%. So factories, you now have quotas on your electricity usage, and you may no longer charge your phones between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Like, no European government is going to do that. Now, I think the thing that has happened, though, and this is why I think in the long term, Russia has really made a mistake, is because I do think there's been a sea change in how the European Union thinks about energy security, manufacturing security, sovereignty, resilience, all these other things. And you can already see little hints of it. Italy, for instance, just last week, I don't think we're used to thinking of Italy as a great geopolitical power, but just in the last week, they signed deals in the Republic of Congo and Angola to source new gas projects. I mean, that's sort of a signpost if ever there was one. You've got Ursula von der Leyen is in India this week talking about new councils that they're going to set up on technology and trade and things like that. If you want to isolate Russia and China, and you want to build a stronger European Union that can resist some of the forces that are coming from Russia, that's exactly the sort of thing you have to do. The problem is, and this is embedded in your question, it's going to take years. You can't just flip a switch. So I think a lot of the European Union member countries have this problem where they don't like what Russia's doing. They understand that they've wasted some time in the past couple of years, but at the same time, there's a certain line they feel like they can't go across, because otherwise, what the Russians have been telling them, you're going to, what do the Russians say? You're going to commit harakiri from an energy perspective. And I think Le Pen and some of these others have picked up that phraseology from the Russians. That's true. It's true even for Poland. I know that you guys in Poland have a very ambitious government plan to rid yourself of all Russian energy by the end of the year. Good luck. I don't know where you're going to source the rest of that energy or how you're going to afford the massive prices elsewhere, because yes, you can go to South Africa or Colombia or some of these other countries to get some of these commodities, but everybody's trying to do that. The prices are going up literally every single day, and we're in an inflationary environment in general. You mentioned food. I mean, it's not just the fact that basically Ukrainian agricultural exports are off the table. You've got one of the worst droughts in recorded history in South America in the last 100 years. Brazil, I think, said it was the worst drought they've experienced in their entire recorded history since they've had a weather service. And that means less corn and less soybeans and more expensive coffee, all these other sorts of things. As we're talking today, India is going through a massive heat wave. Just a month ago, they were talking about how they were going to export wheat to the rest of the world because Russian and Ukrainian wheat wasn't going to be on the market. Now they're revising their yields down. So all of these things, I think, are structural forces that make most of the world interested in containing the conflict right now rather than making it any worse. But I think the world is also moving towards a situation in 2 or 3 years to where it's not as dependent as Russia as it is right now on some of these commodities. And if there is future Russian aggression, it can be mitigated or it can be pushed back against. And unfortunately, that also means Russia's probably going to feel like its back is even more against the wall over the short term, because if they're going to make a move, they're never going to have more leverage over the West than they have right now.
And let's be more granular. So what is your forecast
Sure.
in terms of the European governments doing, like, let's say, June, July, August, September, October? Like Germans, for example. What do you think?
I don't think they're going to do it. But call your Hungarian friends and see if you can get them to withdraw their objections. I mean, the reports that I've read about who's holding up the sanctions on energy, the Germans seem to be susceptible to public opinion. You seem to be able to shame them enough into doing things if you tweet enough bad things about them, or the rest of Europe criticizes them enough. The ones that are actually holding up the discussions about energy sanctions, from what I can tell, is Austria and Hungary. So if you want to get to the real root of the problem, you're going to have to get unanimity inside the European Union, and then you can kind of move forward. And I don't think Germany is your biggest problem there. I think if Germany saw that the rest of the European Union was unanimous about something, they would probably go along. I mean, if you read German political polls at the domestic level, I mean, it's something like 55, 60% of Germans are okay with harsher sanctions on Russia. The government is sort of making the calculation that there's not enough agreement in the European Union, and there's going to be problems economically for us if we take some of these steps. But you've actually seen, just at the popular level in Germany, I think, a real turn against Russia from that perspective. But I'm sorry, I'm rambling. You asked me for my concrete forecast. My concrete forecast is I do not see anything that tells me that Europe is ready to go for oil and natural gas sanctions by September. The only caveat I would put on that forecast is if Russia, for some reason, is able to do a lot better in Donbass than it's done in the rest of this military conflict, and can start thinking about Odessa and Transnistria and start, that axis, maybe we're in kind of a different world. But the Russian military has not shown itself to be ready for that kind of thing, even though there's some comments out of Russian military officials this week that make me a little nervous on that score.
Yeah. What about food supplies? What about food supplies? Are they in peril in Southern Europe or something? What is your forecast?
Not in Europe. So people like you and me and people in Southern Europe, we're going to pay higher prices for food. There will be times where the thing that we want at the store is not there, and we're going to have to go to alternatives, but there's not going to be outright shortages. The place that this is really going to affect people is in developing markets and emerging economies. And we've already seen some of this happening. Pakistan had, a political transition here in the last week. That was because of rising food prices. Peru, you had people blocking the streets and calling for the end of the Castillo regime there. That was because of rising food prices. Just last week, the UN was warning about a potential famine in East Africa. So that's countries like Somalia, Ethiopia. Those are places where there's going to be actual food shortages, and I think where you could see real political unrest. So it's not the food situation is a crisis for some of those countries that are dependent on those imports. And I think you've also seen that dependence moderate some of the political actions of some of these actors. For instance, Turkey was very strong out of the gate, seemed to be supporting Ukraine at the beginning of the war, has pulled back quite a bit. It's pulled back quite a bit because it imports a lot of energy and a lot of food from Russia. So, they're trying to keep those kind of trade routes open. But if you're a country that has been dependent on Russian and Ukrainian exports for your food stock, you're in trouble. That's not going to be Europe. It's going to be those countries in developing parts of the world that can't afford the higher prices are going to be muscled out by other countries that are just going to say, okay, we'll replace the Ukrainian corn with, corn from over here and we'll pay a higher price for it.
So if I could, when you speak about grain supplies, especially through the Black Sea, one's mind has to drift to MENA, Middle East, North Africa, right? And again, you had those countries like Lebanon or even Egypt, which I think also had a period of certain unrest in like last weeks over the staples, the bread price and stuff like that. And of course, it's a bit of a cheap analogy, but everybody throws it around. So I feel okay with it, with the stipulation that the Arab Spring was largely, or at least influenced, this discontent erupted also because of raising grain prices. So I don't think they managed to diversify a lot away from Russia or Ukraine, right? Since in the last decade.
No, it's a good point. So Egypt, like Turkey, has still been importing lots of Russian grain. And despite the conflict, Russian exports seem to be getting out of the Black Sea. Ukraine is kind of off the board, but Russian exports seem to be getting out. And Ukraine is planting. I'm not sure what their export situation is going to look like in July. You're absolutely right to bring up the Arab Spring as a comparison. The thing to understand, though, there is that the Arab Spring was really a local food problem. So there was a generational drought in Syria and Iraq, which was the breadbasket of the region. And you had a lot of these Syrian and Iraqi farmers leave their farms, go back into the cities. And so they provided some of this outgrowth. And so the Arab Spring had multiple hotspots. The place where it really was serious was Syria. It tore that country apart. Egypt, Tunisia, yes, they had revolutions, but then things kind of went back to the way that they were before. It was really in Syria and Iraq that things got bad. The difference is this is not about a drought in one part of the world that is affecting food supply in that part of the world. This is a global systemic issue with global supply chains and global supply, which is why it's not going to be focused just on the Middle East and North Africa. Some of those countries, to your point, are very dependent. I'm less concerned about Egypt because they've been able to source some alternatives and they have been very proactive about doing that. A country that has not been proactive about doing that is Tunisia. And they get something like 50% of their grains from just Ukraine, which is the one that's really off the market. So I'm very concerned about countries like Tunisia. But again, it's not so much, okay, it's Arab Spring 2.0. We're going to look at the Middle East and North Africa. It's really, okay, it's like the Arab Spring, except on a global scale. And let's identify the countries that are particularly exposed to Russian and Ukrainian exports and which cannot afford to substitute easily to other places. So I think countries or regions to look at are Central Asia. We're really worried about Central Asia. Southeast Asia, especially now with these heat waves affecting agricultural yields there, and then select countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America. Those are the types of countries where it's not just going to be kind of inconvenience and higher prices that you and I are going to face. It's going to be full-on crises that could lead to sort of the political unrest we saw in 2010, 2011 in the MENA region.
And also major, especially if you get sub-Saharan Africa, as you mentioned, you get population movements, right? Again, like increased moving up north. So
absolutely. I mean, and I know that you guys have been taking in a lot of Ukrainians. Let's, what happens if there's another refugee flow coming up from the Middle East or from sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, that was one of the things that challenged the very fabric of the European Union in 2015. That'll probably happen again at some point. It'll be interesting to see if the European Union is strong enough to handle that this time around.
It's far less tore up back then, the fabric, right, as compared to now. And that is also interesting. I wanted to, if I could, ask two questions. The first one is, how do you view the Continental project? Looking at the inputs that happened over the last months, the role of Germany, how Germany acted, how there is always this sort of underlying rivalry between Germany and France, and they both look for Russia to balance, right, at the end of the day. So that is one thing, and then I have a second question. But maybe so, do you see the consolidation as likely to continue, or do you percentage-wise see a reasonable percentage that there will be a significant fracture?
Yeah, I'd be curious for both you and Jacek's point of view on this, but I'll tell you my answer first, and then you can tell me. No, I would say one of the biggest things that's changed in my thinking since I left geopolitical futures and in the years since I've known both of you is that I am much more optimistic about the European Union than I was even 5 years ago, because it seems to me that the external forces that are facing Europe are greater than the internal forces that really made it impossible for the EU to kind of grow up and govern itself in the early 2000s and even into the 2010s. You've got China, you've got Russia, you've got Turkey. I mean, there's so many powers where no single European state can really hope to resist them. But together, the European Union is still a really powerful and coherent geopolitical actor if it wants to be. So I think that's going to be true going forward. I'm not sure about this, but I would guess that neither of you are happy with the extent to which Germany has objected to Russia's invasion. I would tell you that from my comfy position over here sitting on the Mississippi River, where I'm not right next to the war, I think there's been a huge change in German strategic thinking. And I think the dependence on energy in the short term is preventing them from doing anything huge. But I would say there's a phrase in the United States, I don't know if it translates into Polish. It's don't look a gift horse in the mouth. It's basically, okay, you didn't get everything that you wanted, but you are getting a lot. I mean, Germany is throwing hundreds of billions of euros at green energy so that it's not dependent on Russia anymore. They're even talking about reopening nuclear plants or thinking about nuclear energy again. That's one of the reasons we're in this position with Germany. What was it, 100 billion euros to modernizing the German military? Saying those words runs shivers down my spine because of what happened historically when Germany arms, but they're talking about it. They're taking positive steps to do it. It happens to be a very divided German coalition government, and they're very new. It's not like it's Angela Merkel who has 10 years of experience behind them. I think they're kind of moving their way forward. The thing that really worried me was Le Pen going to maybe take over France, because that I think would have broken things in a significant way. But it turned out that a lot of people, the initial polls maybe were good for Le Pen, but Macron has won, and I viewed that as a vote from the French as pro the European experiment, because it's not like people actually like Macron that much. It was more about, no, we don't like Macron, but we certainly don't like this Le Pen Russia thing. So I think this is only good for the European Union going forward. I think the last question there is, what are these kind of states on the periphery that have been resisting Brussels going to do? I mean, Hungary is sort of the key one because Orban was reelected recently with a large percentage, and Poland and Hungary have kind of been on the outside looking in with the EU. That can't continue. Something's going to have to give there. But I think in general, a lot of these European countries are going to be more open to some of the things Poland has been saying for years, because Poland was right to complain about these things and nobody was listening to them. So I'm positive about the European Union, but I get the sense from you both that maybe you aren't as positive, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Albert, go ahead.
All right. No, I was because again, sort of implied in what you said is that you still view the Germans as primus inter pares, and that this is unlikely to change. But it seems they've taken quite a few hits over their leadership. And again, I think I know the narrative where the Germans or the Western Europeans were naive about Russia. I don't think they were. I mean, I also didn't expect the invasion. I thought this was senseless, and they were getting what they wanted. They should have just been patient. And it's a huge question why. But I don't think my personal belief is that they weren't naive. They knew perfectly well. It's just the threat emanating from Russia was not an existential one for them, so it was hence acceptable. And there was still a willing dance partner. But what I wanted to ask is, could you imagine the Union where with Germany taking hits with, again, the build, because again this goes back to Bismarck, right, and the way you manage Europe with Russians. Can you imagine this organization, the continent, without the Germans at the helm?
And if I may add some flavor from the past, those Poles, like us, they're always crazy people, and always they remind about old stories of the Commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, how big it was, how successful it was. Let me give you a story of both success and a failure, and that should be a lesson for Germans. So it was successful.
Teaching Germans lessons, I see.
For at least 2 centuries, because the crown of Poland was much stronger than Lithuania, And still, the crowners, as we said, so Poles, decided not to impose the king on the Lithuanians. Okay, so that was a balancing game in favor of the Lithuanians, so that they feel at home in the Union. Once we felt so powerful in the 17th century that when the Ukrainians, at the time, the Ukrainian Cossacks came to our, parliament and asked for the same thing, we whipped them down, okay? And we had a civil war, and they started balancing against the external actors, introducing Russia into the European game. So that's exactly the lesson for Germans. If they want to rule, and if they want to have their beautiful European continent, they cannot be in charge. And that's a tricky game to play, and especially for Germans. And this is the thing. That's the question: if they can do it, because people would welcome the stability of the market, the stability of geopolitical stability in the very turmoil times that are ahead of us. But it cannot be a German ways of ruling the way, so to speak. That's why it's going to be very difficult to manage the system. Plus, there's one more thing. Europe is not an island, so the pressure is from both United States and both Great Britain and United States are not interested in consolidation. They want to have, for example, the intermarium countries to be independent and stay within the European system, but as long as it is within the Atlantic community, which is in question, if China is entering Europe, and so on and so forth. At the same time, China is entering Europe with investment. Russia is with military power, and the Levant and Middle East with waves of people and other unrest pressures. So, what is the answer to all those questions? I have not seen any strategic plan by the European elites that would come up with a solution, and they would be in agreement on all those four threats. Yeah. And that's a whole problem. That's a whole problem, with Europe.
I like how demanding you are, Jacek, or not demanding. I like how high your standards are, because I would also want to see a perfect plan. But I'll also let the American now lecture the Poles, in the sense that one of my favorite writers or historians is Shelby Foote. I think he passed away 10 or 20 years ago. He was sort of one of the best U.S. historians of the Civil War here in the United States. And he, in this documentary about the Civil War, he talked about how the real genius of the United States of America was not its military power, was not its technology, was not the Mississippi River, or any of these other things. It was our gift for compromise. And I think the United States has lost some of that gift. You can see how polarized our political environment is. And I think one of the reasons Russia felt empowered to do this was because the U.S. was distracted. Certainly had to do with, U.S. domestic politics looking fractious, with the United States pulling out of Afghanistan and not really caring what was going to happen. I think all of that went into the decision-making process in Moscow. But I bring up Shelby Foote and compromise to say that the European Union is going to have to reform itself a little bit. And the only way that's going to happen is with some level of compromise, because you're absolutely right. The Germans can't rule it all. That's not going to work for the rest of Europe. But you can't just expect Germany to completely go along with everything everybody else is saying. So both sides are going to have to compromise and figure out how it's going to happen going forward. I may be naive and I may be too optimistic. I think there is space for that, but you're not going to get a strategic, coherent plan out of Brussels until those difficult conversations have happened, and until the compromise is made clear, and until the power structures and the power sharing agreements are all there. And it's not going to happen on a timeline that you like. It's going to take years if it's actually going to be successful. So the thing that I would be looking for is openness from Germany to compromise, openness from Paris to compromise. If they're still treating you exactly the same way they were before this war, then I'm wrong. And you have a much bigger problem on your hands, because you're not going to be able to balance against a lot of these forces. But my analysis would be that this should start that conversation. And if the European Union can build some institutional structures that allow it to respond to these things in a coherent way, the result, the end product of that should be the types of strategic plans that you're talking about. The problem is right now, there's no institution in Brussels that will do that anyone will listen to. So build the institutions and they will come, hopefully. But but maybe not. I think you have your finger on exactly all the reasons I might be wrong, and I can't refute some of your points.
Yeah, I'm still, yeah, your points are very rational, and we'll see what the future will bring.
It's difficult being a rational person in an irrational world, isn't it?
Yeah.
You kind of start the question who's really rational, right? But it's surviving in those times. But look, so let's assume you're correct, and there is the European Union like trots along as a unified project, and moreover, the Germans do rearm, and everybody else rearms, and this essentially removes a leverage the US has over Europe. The US complains a lot about that, but it's still tens of thousands of soldiers on European soil, and this is a leverage. It cuts both ways. So one of the things that was spoken about a lot in the context of the conflict in Ukraine was the revitalizing the transatlantic ties. And I was wondering, do you agree with this, and do you see a long-term revitalization of those ties, or is it because I'm sorry for like imprinting my viewpoint here, but I thought the true test of that, of whether we really see the transatlantic ties created anew, is the attitude the Europeans will have towards China. And I've seen very little to suggest that it could be changing, or it could be aligned towards how the US views China. I saw Josep Borrell, the High Representative. I don't know if you've seen this interview of his when he says, you absolutely cannot compare Russia to China. China is not a military threat. It's a key partner. Basically he said Volkswagen is selling 40% of its cars in China, chill. So what do you think?
There's two questions there, two big questions. So let's take the transatlantic relationship first, and then we'll take the China question. Yeah. Look, I've been saying this for years to Europeans, and I've said this to Poles too. You can't rely on the United States anymore. I'm sorry to say that. I wish that it wasn't that way. But I mean, the transatlantic relationship is in an upswing because the Biden administration has prioritized it. We're not sure if the Biden administration is going to be here in 2 years. I mean, we're going into elections. It's going to be very fractious. Who knows what's going to come after it? So the United States is really on a 4 to 8 year kind of political cycle basis. And if anything, I think a lot of, and especially the Germans, woke up and realized this when Trump was elected, because he was pushing them on things that his administration prioritized in ways that Europe wasn't used to being pushed around on. So if European states didn't kind of understand that the United States was not that reliable actor that it once was from this basis, I would hope that the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the changes in US foreign policy over the past 6 to 8 years, which have really been, I would expect they feel like knee-jerk changes. That's just how American politics is going to work for as long as American politics is this polarized. And I think that's going to be true for the rest of the decade. I'm an optimist in the end about the United States. I think the United States will come out more powerful and will regret some of the things that it has done and probably will do in the coming years ahead. But right now, the United States is in a vortex of its own political instability. We are self-absorbed and arguing with ourselves all the time. And I don't think there's a lot of space for long-term strategic thinking about what's going to happen to Europe. It's everything is what is happening lately, knee-jerk reactions and things like that. So the transatlantic relationship is great right now. I'm not saying it's going to go away, but it is not the dependable bedrock of European security that it once was. And anybody who is thinking that it's going to be that, I think, is making a pretty critical mistake. On the China issue, I mean, I didn't see the Borrell interview. If he said that China is not a military threat, then, well, he's literally sticking his head in the sand. I do, however, think that the United States has been a little unproductive in the ways that it has gone after China, because Borrell is right about one thing. China is very different than Russia in that it is in every single global supply chain that we have in the world. So it's one thing to eliminate Russia and isolate it economically, like nobody uses the ruble. Yes, we have problems with oil and natural gas and some food exports, but the market will figure itself out. Like they are a commodity exporter. That's not China. The computer that I'm working on right now was manufactured in China. The phone that's sitting below me was manufactured in China. This mouse that I'm using was manufactured in China. If you want to isolate China from the global economy, what you're really talking about is completely rebuilding global supply chains. And if you thought inflation was high now in some of these countries, if you're going to wake up tomorrow and say, got to rebuild global supply chains, here's $10 trillion of stimulus to rebuild the infrastructure necessary to do that, I don't even want to think about how high inflation would go that way. So in that sense, you can't just isolate China that way. I would say Europe, though, has been a little bit more pragmatic about China than it has been in the past. To Jacek's point, there are some very impressive strategic plans in the European Commission website about how to be self-reliant in semiconductor manufacturing. Some of the companies that are crucial to global supply chains for semiconductors are European because ASML is the only one in town who makes the advanced EUV lithography equipment, not the US, not China, not anybody else. So it's the Dutch who have control over that market. There are things that Europe has that it can use in that sense to build more resilient supply chains and maybe build relationships with a country like India, with a country like Sub-Saharan Africa. I would also note that the European Union does not talk about China just as a partner anymore. It's sometimes a partner, sometimes a competitor. And I've seen that language change in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that's significant. Again, I think what you have to think of with China is hope for the best and plan for the worst and try to minimize the damage in the short term. So that means there's no easy solution. You're not just going to flip a switch and China's going to be isolated and do whatever you want. It's too big an economy. It's too integrated into global supply chain. What you can do is build resilience, build redundancy, try and establish some red lines past, don't do this, or we're going to do this in a way that failed with kind of Russia fundamentally, and prepare for a future where you're wrong, where China does react like a revisionist power. That's all part of the policy. So I don't think you can cut China off. I do think there are things you can do to prepare for China relations deteriorating. And I think the EU is starting to do that. Maybe it's not enough, but I see signs that it's starting to think that way.
What do you think about what is this, traffic jams, this clock of the ships in Shanghai? What do you think was the really underlying reason why Shanghai is quarantined and stuff? Do you think this is a sort of a manipulation of the supply chain? So that's, so to kill someone, to kill someone that's in the supply chain. What do you think? What is your feeling?
Yeah, now we talked about one mystery so far, why Putin felt he needed to invade Ukraine, even though he was getting everything he wanted. A second mystery here is why is China locking down cities due to COVID-19? I can definitely concoct a conspiracy theory along the lines of commodity prices were going too high. China understands that it is still the primary driver of demand in the world, and nobody raising interest rates is going to decrease inflation. But if China decides it wants to take down inflation by stopping demand inside of China itself, that's going to work. And, that's definitely going to happen. I would also say that I've been surprised to the extent to which Xi Jinping has tied himself personally to the zero COVID policies. He seems to be very publicly going and saying, no, this is me. This is the Chinese Communist Party. We're doing COVID better than everybody else. And this is what is most important. So there are no scapegoats for what's going on. There's no, this is a local official, I'm going to fix everything. It seems to me that Xi is really saying, no, this is a project of the Chinese government. The only thing that I have to say is that I'm not sure exactly why it's happening. We could, speculate, but we won't know unless we have Xi in front of us and are able to talk to him. What I can say with you with some certainty is the global supply chains, which were just finally starting to get somewhat normalized, this is going to be another blow to them because if China's going to lock down cities like this, it's going to be very difficult for these Chinese factories to continue production. And probably the global economy is going to suffer a lot of things from this. I would also say that if you look inside China itself, it is using, in the same way that I'm encouraging Europeans or Americans to view this crisis as a moment to shift and invest in sort of self-reliance and things like that, China is absolutely doing that. So none of what's happening is preventing them, for instance, from building out government-sponsored data centers in the interior. None of this is preventing them from supporting the real estate market, which, they've so far engineered a pretty impressive real estate bubble from crashing in their faces in the midst of a lot of global uncertainty. So my takeaway with China is that the domestic economy is ultimately what Xi cares the most about. And he must be calculating that the cost of the lockdowns ultimately is better for the Chinese domestic economy going forward than anything else is. That's my best read, but you and I are both dealing with limited information there. And in the same way that I'm a little confused with what Putin did in Ukraine, I'm a little confused with the extent to which China's trying to keep the zero COVID policies in place.
Can we sort of understand what sort of cargo or what sort of ships, what sort of segments of the market will this impact? Can we, plan anything based on what data we have with those ships, or we're just still within the uncharted territory of guessing?
I mean, I don't want to be too flippant, but the answer to your question is everything. They make everything. Like they make your furniture, they make the headphone. Like they are still the global factory in the world. Now, companies have been relocating away from China, and companies that have made that decision strategically are probably going to do better. So Apple, for instance, is an example of a company that has been worried about its China operations for a long time and already came out and said, I believe earlier this week, I think it was Foxconn that said, despite the China disruptions, that none of their factory output was really going to be affected because they were able to shift things around. But in terms of the ships and cargo and things like that, and it's both sides. You have to understand, so China is a major importer of commodities. So if ships aren't getting into China and they're consuming less food or energy or all these other things because of lockdowns, that means the price of commodities is going to go down, which actually might be a good thing considering how elevated commodities are globally. But then the output also gets affected. So things coming out of Chinese factories aren't going to come on time. That's going to increase kind of prices on the supply side because you're getting that constriction. So it's really kind of across the board. And this gets back to Albert's question. It's one thing to say you want to challenge China and want the EU to take a position towards China, but they are so integrated into the global economy. It's not easy to just sort of snap your fingers and say, okay, now we're going to isolate them, because that's how embedded they are within the global economy. I think one of the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war, and maybe of these COVID-19 lockdowns in China, is that countries will realize just how dependent they are on a source of manufacturing that was very reliable for 30 years, but which isn't reliable anymore going forward. And so you're going to have to build out redundancy and resilience in other parts of the world, or even at home in ways that you didn't have to before.
That's the thing. I've run into an interview with Catherine Tai, the USDR, and she it was like sort of had mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand she said that I don't really see decoupling happening, which is reasonable, for the reasons you pointed out, or at least a very long-term process. But then she said, and that was worrying, that what she wants to see is recoupling. And, I think, and what she meant, recoupling was a code word to a trip down memory lane to the 90s and the role the Chinese were playing in the 90s, which is, low margin kind of stuff, and profit margins really being transferred back to the US, which I think is a great idea, but it might be difficult. I don't think Chinese are going to go for it. So I have two questions. One for setting this relationship up, which is, I guess, the question we asked you back the last time we were speaking. But also, if you wanted to decouple or partially decouple and recreate this industrial base in the US, you would really have to have a very basic fundamental understanding within the society, some accord where we're going, right? And why, and what are the norms and goals and objectives and social cohesion. And that thing seems to be completely gone. So maybe I'll start with the domestic US question. This is a great opportunity. I'm sure you think about this a lot. So do you see the US, like the crisis, obviously you said, but it sort of sounds like you think it's a cyclical thing and hence manageable and seen before. So do you see this? How do you reconcile this? And once you reconcile, is the direction the US is going to point towards is what we're thinking about, this ambitious plan, or rather something else? Do you see civil? People are talking about civil war in 2024, or one of the sides disagreeing with the result of the elections, so this is sort of like worrying.
Well, yeah, if there's civil war in the United States in 2024, I'll be moving to Warsaw with you guys and playing basketball with Jacek every other week.
Yeah, you remember I play basketball. That's nice.
Yeah, I'm ready. Don't worry. If the US, if I'm wrong about the US and things go bad, I'll be in the streets of Warsaw teaching you all how to do a jump hook. I'm glad you brought up Catherine Tai's statements, because that's a great way of me trying to say more succinctly what I was saying before, which was, in the Trump administration, it was all tariffs and decoupling and strategic competitor, blah, blah, blah. That was like 2-3 years ago. Now it's completely opposite, and you've got a completely different sort of framework in there. And if Biden loses in 2024 for some reason, you could get a completely new framework on top of it. There's not a lot of consistency in policy, especially when things change that way in the United States. There's not going to be recoupling. There's not going to be radical decoupling but there is right now already selective decoupling. So industries that are critical to national security are already decoupling from China. That's absolutely clear. It's already happening, especially when it comes, I think semiconductors is the field where this is most appreciated. But it's been happening with 5G and telecoms. It's been happening with data center. It's been happening with certain things kind of throughout the supply chain. The problem with the United States, I don't think, is its domestic problems from that point of view. The problem is it's just not economical to manufacture those things here. You could probably manufacture an iPhone in the United States. It would probably cost $8,000 by the end of it all, and probably wouldn't work as well. The challenge for the United States is going to be about nearshoring, not reshoring. So that's actually one of the reasons that Cognitive Investments, this is not investment advice, but I'll tell you, I am currently long Brazilian equities and long Chilean equities, and I'm exploring investment in Mexico, because I think those are countries that are primed to soak up some of that interest from abroad, and especially people that are moving manufacturing options away from China and looking for some of those options. So, I mean, the United States has sort of taken the Western Hemisphere for granted. It's been involved in all these Eurasian conflicts for decades now in the post-Cold War world. But I think what's happening now is the United States is sort of looking around and realizing that even in its own backyard, Chinese economic influence has been increasing. The Russians are supporting powers in Cuba and Venezuela. Not only can that not continue, the United States is also wasting a huge amount of potential and a huge amount of resilience that it could be in sort of prioritizing relationships with some of those South American and Latin American countries. So I don't think it's about U.S. companies just completely bringing all their operations back to the U.S. For critical technologies, yes. But for the most part, I think what you're looking at here is the United States looking around the world and sort of moving operations. They're going to keep some in Southeast Asia. Vietnam has been a big benefactor of that. Indonesia is another country, although it plays both ways and has a lot of Chinese investment. But it's countries like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, some of these countries that have been punching below their weight for a long time, which U.S. foreign policy has been ignoring for a long time, that I expect to be the benefactors, because those are the places where the cost structure makes sense, where you could actually relocate. And yes, you'll charge a little bit more, but it's not going to be an $8,000 iPhone.
So what about cohesiveness of the U.S.? And where does it lead, even if it's achieved? What will be the silver strand or silver thread?
Silver lining. I'm sure you guys both relate to this. It's hardest to be objective about your own country, right? So let me put that on the cards by saying it's difficult for me to be objective about the United States, but I will try my best. It is certainly the most polarized the United States has been during my lifetime, which isn't to say very much, as I've been lucky enough to live during pretty easy times, I think, thus far. I don't think that the level of division within the United States is approaching yet where it was, say, in the 1960s, in the late 1960s or early 1970s. I don't think it's where it was in the late 1920s or early 1930s. I will also say that if you look at U.S. history, I mean, obviously the Civil War was a big gap in this, but since the Civil War, the United States has gone through major political transitions without violence. It has been able to really reshape itself from the inside and remake itself, honoring its democratic principles, never 100%, but nothing is ever perfect, but being able to evolve past it. My sense of the United States is that things are going to get worse, that things economically have not gotten so bad that the real drivers for political compromise are there yet. I expect that some of these inflation problems, the increase in debt, having to think about reshoring supply chains, I think those things are all going to get worse before they're going to get better. And at a certain point, I think that's going to create a political reality where one party, and I don't know which party it's going to be, but one party is going to have enough control to really assert itself and try and remake the United States going forward. In the 1980s, it was Reagan and the Republicans. In the 1930s, it was Roosevelt and the Democrats. We're waiting. I'm waiting for that kind of moment in U.S. politics. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we're kind of years off. The Democrats technically had the Senate and the House in the past 2 years, but not really. They had like a razor thin margin. And it was, one or two of their Democratic senators were really independents who didn't vote along with Biden's plan anyway. And the Republicans are probably going to take one, if not two, houses of Congress back here in the midterms in November. So I still see a United States that is very divided, where economically and politically things are going to get worse before they get better. So I'm pessimistic in the short term, but optimistic that in the long term, the United States can transcend those divisions. But that doesn't help the world very much. The rest of the world would probably like the United States to accelerate this process and get over itself. I'm sad to report that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. I think it's time to wrap up, guys.
Can I go for one final big boy?
Yeah.
So again, I'm using a lot of quotes, but in his New Year's address, Finnish president, it was very interesting telling for me, because he said, look, he stated the obvious, that international order is now decomposing. But then he went on to say, and the contours of the new one are only beginning to be visible. And I think that is wishful thinking. We got good decade or more of instability, or more before you come up with a stable structure to manage international order. So even though do you see any contours showing up, or if you were to do like proper, 8-ball, trying to figure out what's going to happen in the world, what would be at least the basic founding assumptions about the mechanics of the order that will come?
I'll answer that in a weird way. I think geopolitical analysis is inherently arrogant because it thinks that it can, or it makes the claim that it can simplify what is dynamic to something that is static and describe it in terms of models or orders or things like that. I think that is a useful analytical exercise, but I think sometimes analysts, and I'm really talking about myself here, can get in trouble when they take those things a little bit too seriously. Because the moment you say that there is an order, it could change tomorrow. Politics is dynamic. It is constantly changing all of the time. So I think it's fair to say that over the last 30 years, there has been a relative amount of order, which is to say there's been predictability in how the world acts because the United States was the most powerful country. There were still unexpected blips in this. I mean, it's not like the last 30 years were perfect. We had genocide in Rwanda. We had the Balkan Wars. We had 9/11. We had Russia in Georgia. We had the rise of Xi Jinping in China. So it's not like things have been perfect in the last 30 years for this liberal world order. So I say all that to say that I'm reflexively almost uncomfortable with the idea of reducing things down to order because I don't know how much order there ever was in the first place. There is certainly no contours of a new order to see going forward. I think instead what we need to get accustomed to dealing with right now is a really dynamic geopolitical environment. That's what it means when the world is multipolar. There's not one country or even two countries calling the shot. There's not an architecture where you can just go and say, okay, this is what's going to happen, and it's going to go forward from here. The last time there was a multipolar world, it was the late 1800s. It was a time of shifting alliances. Countries were trading with each other, even as they were fighting with each other. It was a time of rampant technology development. All these sorts of things are going to happen in tandem. So I would agree with you in the sense that there's no contours of a new order emerging. If anything, we're just going back to how international affairs usually is, which is messy and dynamic and depends on things changing all the time. In some ways, the last 30 years where there was one dominant power and everybody else was less powerful relative to it, that's not what happens in most of history. So in some ways, we're reverting to the organic mean rather than, I think you're right. It's wrong to think of us building some new order from the old order. This last order was a nice 30-year period that we'll all look on fondly, but it wasn't the natural way that international affairs usually works.
Yeah.
So you say here's chaos, which is sort of terrible for the world, but again, sometimes systems need to be reset. But great news for cognitive.
Hold on, it's not necessarily terrible. So, like the last time there was a multipolar world, it was La Belle Epoque, is what the French called it. We got the creation of the oil-based economy. There was beautiful art. There was beautiful music. There was all sorts of trade happening. And yes, it ended in World War I, and that was terrible.
For great powers, Jacob. That was cool for great powers.
Oh yeah, well, I'm an American, so I come by that honestly.
Yeah, but still, even during this beautiful era, you were also threatened properly, by the British and the French. So it was a close call for you guys as well,
I mean,
that's true, and you're absolutely right to say that for other parts of the world, this was also the age of colonialism. So I wouldn't want to be countries that are in sub-Saharan Africa right now, Central Asia, South America. There are opportunities, but there are also significant threats because when great powers start looking around for how they're going to support themselves, it's usually bad for those parts of the world too. So I take your critique there.
Also, the Belle Epoque began, after a major conflagration here. So we'll see how it happens.
Okay, we're wrapping up, guys. Thank you very much, Jacob Shapiro, Albert Świdziński, Jacek Bartosiak. Thank you, Jacob. That's been, awesome, so to speak.
Yeah, let's do it again soon.
Yeah, take care. Thank you very much, and thank you all. Stay with us for more episodes of Strategy and Future.
All right.